In this episode, I want to help you build a study plan that actually works when your main study tool is your ears instead of a highlighter. The Certified in Governance, Risk, and Compliance (CGRC) exam covers ideas that are sometimes abstract, like governance intent, risk reasoning, and compliance expectations. So an audio-first approach has to do more than just expose you to information. A good plan needs three things working together. Timeboxing so you can fit studying into real life, sequencing so concepts build on each other instead of colliding, and retention tactics so you don't feel like everything leaks out of your brain the next morning. If you are brand new, you also need a plan that respects cognitive fatigue, because long study sessions often create the illusion of progress while producing weak memory. The goal here is to create a repeatable routine you can sustain, because steady repetition beats heroic bursts every time. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at CGRC.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. The first foundation is timeboxing, which is just a polite way of saying you decide in advance how long you will study, and you stop when that time ends. Many beginners assume that more time automatically means more learning, but the brain does not behave like a gas tank where you can just keep pouring knowledge in. In audio learning, attention is the limiting factor, because if your mind drifts while you are listening, the words keep flowing but nothing sticks. Timeboxing solves that by creating short, focused windows where you are more likely to stay present. It also makes studying psychologically easier, because committing to 20 minutes feels manageable in a way that committing to 2 hours does not. The most important part is consistency, so it is better to pick a time box you can keep even on a busy day than to pick an ambitious schedule you will abandon after a week. Once you have a realistic study window, you need to choose a rhythm that matches how people actually live. A common and effective rhythm is to have a primary session that introduces new material and a smaller follow-up session that reinforces it. That might look like a longer listen on one day and a shorter recap on the next day, but the exact pattern matters less than the idea that reinforcement is scheduled, not optional. Retention is not something you hope happens. It is something you design into your week. If you only listen to new content every day, you will feel productive, but your memory will be shallow and fragile. If you only review, you will feel safe, but not progress. The rhythm you want alternates between pushing forward and looping back, so your understanding grows while your recall stays strong. Sequencing is the second big pillar, and it is where many self-made study plans fall apart. Governance, risk, and compliance topics are interconnected, so if you jump randomly between them, everything feels like a tangle of terms rather than a system. A beginner-friendly sequence starts with what the program is trying to accomplish at a high level, then moves into how organizations make decisions, then moves into how those decisions are documented and proven. In other words, you want a story that begins with purpose, moves through process, and ends in evidence. This sequence matters because it gives every new concept a place to land. When you later hear about controls, or frameworks, or system boundaries, you can connect them to that story instead of storing them as isolated trivia. A good sequence reduces confusion because you always know what problem a concept is trying to solve. To make audio learning work, you also need a simple way to stay oriented while listening. A practical approach is to carry a small mental checklist that you apply to every concept you hear. You ask yourself, what is this? Why does it exist? Who uses it? And what does success look like? That sounds basic, but it forces your brain to build meaning, and meaning is what creates durable memory. Without meaning, you might remember a phrase for a day or two, but you will not be able to use it when a question asks you to choose the best next step in a governance process. Another benefit is that the checklist keeps you engaged, which prevents passive listening. Audio learning becomes powerful when you treat it like a conversation where you are constantly answering tiny questions in your own head. The words are still coming from the speaker, but your mind is working alongside them instead of drifting behind. Retention is the third pillar, and the key idea is that memory strengthens when you practice pulling information out, not when you practice putting information in. Listening is input, and input is necessary, but it is not enough. After a listening session, You should do a short recall moment where you try to restate the main ideas without replaying them. You can do this out loud if you are alone or silently if you are not, but the action is the same. You force yourself to retrieve. Retrieval is hard, and that hardness is what makes it effective. If you can easily remember everything, you are not training memory. You are just repeating comfort material. In an audio-first plan, you schedule these recall moments like part of the session, because if you leave them to motivation, they tend to disappear when life gets busy. A simple way to structure those recall moments is to use 3 levels of recall: summary, explanation, and application. First, you summarize in a few sentences what you just heard, focusing on the main message rather than details. Then you explain one concept in your own words as if teaching it to someone else, because teaching forces clarity. Finally, you apply it by imagining a small decision an organization would face, and you describe how the concept would guide that decision. This turns abstract content into a usable tool, which is what the exam rewards. The practice also reveals weak spots fast, because you will notice where your explanation becomes vague or where your application feels forced. When that happens, it is not a failure. It is a map showing you what to revisit. Over time, this pattern builds confidence because you are repeatedly proving to yourself that you can use the knowledge, not just recognize it. Time boxing and retention get even stronger when you use spaced repetition, which is the idea that you revisit material after increasing intervals rather than cramming it in one block. The brain consolidates learning over time, and spaced repetition works with that natural process. In an audio-only approach, spacing can be as simple as revisiting a concept the next day, then again a few days later, then again the next week. The point is not perfection. The point is building multiple retrieval attempts across time so the memory becomes stable. Beginners sometimes worry that they are forgetting between sessions, but that forgetting is part of the process. If you never feel any forgetting, you are probably reviewing too soon and not strengthening the retrieval pathway. The plan should expect some forgetting and treat it as a training opportunity rather than as a discouraging surprise. Sequencing also benefits from something called interleaving, which means you mix related topics once you have a basic foundation, instead of studying one topic in isolation for a long time. In the CGRC world, this is especially helpful because questions often combine ideas like governance intent, risk impact, and compliance evidence in the same scenario. If you only study each area in a separate silo, you might know each one individually, but struggle to integrate them under pressure. Interleaving can be gentle and beginner-friendly, like alternating between a governance concept and a compliance concept that depends on it. This keeps your brain practicing connections rather than memorizing definitions. The trick is to interleave after you have a baseline, because mixing too early can feel chaotic. Think of it like learning to play music. You practice scales first, then you start combining them into actual songs. Because this is audio first, you also need to control the environment where listening happens. If you listen while doing something that demands language processing, like writing messages or reading detailed text, you will absorb less because your brain cannot fully process 2 language streams at once. The best audio study moments happen during activities that are physically busy but mentally light, like walking, commuting, or doing routine chores. Even then, you should be honest about your attention, because sometimes stress or fatigue makes listening ineffective. This is where time boxing helps again, because short sessions reduce the chance that you will drift for long stretches. Another helpful habit is to intentionally reset attention at the start of each session by reminding yourself of one question you want answered. When the session ends, you check whether you can answer it, and that creates a clear purpose that keeps you present. Another practical piece is how to handle terms and acronyms without turning your learning into a blur of letters. International Information System Security Certification Consortium, ISC2, and CGRC are names you will hear often. But the bigger challenge is that governance and compliance work is full of formal labels that can feel similar. An audio-first plan should emphasize meaning over memorization by attaching each new term to a role in a process. For example, when you learn about a policy, you connect it to governance intent, and when you learn about evidence, you connect it to compliance proof. If you encounter an acronym like NIST, you keep it unspaced because it is not written in all caps in the same way you might see in other contexts, and you focus instead on what it represents in plain language. The goal is that terms become signposts in a story, not a stack of flashcards floating in space. When your brain has a story, it can reconstruct details under pressure even if you don't remember every phrase perfectly. A good study plan also needs a method for dealing with confusion, because confusion is guaranteed when you are new. Instead of treating confusion as a sign you are not cut out for the material, treat it as a normal part of building a mental model. One effective method is to keep a running list in your mind of the few concepts that consistently feel slippery, like boundaries, controls, or responsibility assignments. After a session, you pick one slippery concept and try to define it in one clean sentence. Then you expand it into a short explanation. Then you give a simple example. If your explanation collapses into vague words like stuff, things, or basically, that's a signal that you need a clearer definition. Over time, this practice turns weak spots into strengths because you keep returning to them with purpose. The plan works best when it expects confusion and builds a routine for resolving it, rather than pretending you will understand everything on first exposure. As your weeks progress, you should also adjust sequencing from learning to integration. Early on, you are building a foundation, so your sessions emphasize definitions, purpose, and basic flow. In the middle, you focus on relationships, like how governance drives requirements and how requirements drive controls and evidence. Later, you practice judgment, which means you spend more of your recall time comparing options and deciding what is most appropriate given a situation. This is where the exam mindset starts to form naturally, because you are training your brain to choose the best answer, not just a correct-sounding one. Audio learning supports this well if you add short mental scenarios, like imagining a system has unclear scope or unclear ownership and asking what the first corrective move should be. You are not doing implementation steps. You are practicing decision logic. When you do this regularly, the exam stops feeling like trickery and starts feeling like you are being asked to demonstrate a familiar kind of reasoning. You also want to plan for the final stretch before the exam, because the last week is where people often panic and sabotage their own retention. The goal of the final stretch is not to learn brand new, complex material. It is to stabilize what you already know and sharpen your recall under mild pressure. That means shorter sessions, more retrieval, and more focus on explaining concepts cleanly. If you try to cram huge new chunks, you may crowd out existing knowledge and increase anxiety, which harms performance. A calmer approach is to revisit core ideas, especially the ones that connect everything else, like scope, requirements, controls, and evidence. You can also practice reading a question in your head and predicting what kind of answer it is seeking, like first step, best control category, or primary responsibility. The result is a mind that feels organized rather than cluttered, which is exactly what you want when the clock is running. To pull everything together, think of an audio-only CGRC study plan as a loop that repeats with small improvements each time. You choose a sustainable time box. You follow a sequence that builds from purpose to process to evidence, and you design retention through retrieval and spacing rather than hoping it happens. You pay attention to the realities of listening, like attention limits and environmental distractions, and you make small adjustments instead of blaming yourself. You use confusion as feedback, not as a verdict, and you gradually shift from learning concepts to integrating them and making judgments. Most importantly, you keep the plan simple enough that you can actually do it on ordinary days, because ordinary days are the real training ground. If you do that, you will arrive at exam day with a steady sense that you have practiced the right kind of thinking, not just heard a lot of words. That steadiness is what turns study time into exam performance.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.